As we're all painfully aware, the pandemic has played havoc with the timely unfolding of many formerly chronologically predictable events. Nonetheless, on behalf of the members of the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Selection Committee, which is comprised of previous winners of the Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar Award, I'm pleased to welcome you today to this lecture by my National Museum of American History colleague, Paula J. Johnson, the 2020, that's 2020, Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. This honor, originally, and rather paraphrastically, called the Smithsonian Secretary's Distinguished Research Lecture Award, has been given 21 times since its inception in the year 2000. Nominations are made by Smithsonian peers of those nominated and must be supported by letters from outside academic adjudicators and by full listings of the nominees' scholarly output. The Distinguished Scholar Award highlights the Smithsonian's commitment to knowledge derived through historical inquiry, the scientific method, rigorous analysis and peer review, and the syntheses that can result from a broad understanding of a particular culture or period. People trust the Smithsonian to care for America's treasures and to pursue and share historical, cultural, and scientific truth. Because of that trust, it's important that we uphold James Smithson's mandate to increase and diffuse knowledge. The Distinguished Scholar Awards, together with the Secretary's Research Prizes and the Research Tent at the annual staff picnic, offer Smithsonian employees, members of Congress, and the public several opportunities each year to learn about the remarkable work that takes place at the institution. Each of these events showcases Smithsonian scholars and the new and innovative ways they are sharing knowledge with the world. The criteria for the Distinguished Scholar Award are, first and unsurprisingly, exceptional and sustained achievement in research, coupled with a long-standing commitment to the Smithsonian and the ability to communicate to both a specialist and a lay audience. I'd like to take a moment to thank my colleagues of the selection committee who were active in this round's review process. From the National Air and Space Museum, David Dvorkin, Michael Neufeld, and Tom Waters. From the National Museum of African Art, Christine Mullen-Kramer. Louise Court, from the Freer and Sackler Galleries, National Museum of Asian Art. Nancy Knowlton and Igor Krupnik of the National Museum of Natural History. Ellen Miles from the National Portrait Gallery, and from the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, Giovanni Fazio, William Foreman, and Christine Jones. To review the nominations, I think my fellow committee members will agree, is both an enlightening and a rather humbling experience. Enlightening in that one learns, at least in a broad sense, of many research projects, some quite long-spanning, which illustrate the breadth and diversity of our collective mission of advancing the increase and diffusion of knowledge. And humbling because each of the nominees is obviously an important figure in his or her chosen field. We are honored to work beside such distinguished scholars who, through their endeavors, uphold the Smithsonian's deserved reputation for excellence. Before we hear Paula Johnson's presentation today, which is entitled Appetite for Change, Research and Reflections of a Food History Curator, Secretary Lonnie Bunch has some observations on the importance of research at the Smithsonian in these perilous times.
Let me begin by thanking Ken Slovic for organizing this program and for his commitment to Smithsonian scholarship throughout the pandemic. And let me thank all of you, the entire committee who assisted throughout the selection process. I am so delighted at long last to honor Paula Johnson as the 2020 Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. As a scholar, I know from personal experience how painstakingly deliberate and time-consuming the process is. And I am in awe of colleagues across the institution who take this work on every day. Their scholarship is central to everything we do at the Smithsonian. At Air and Space, at American History, at the African American Museum, and now as secretary, every step of my career has been guided by the belief that the institution is at our best when we marry our expert scholarship, deep creativity, and rigorous investigation. Scholarship is the engine of the Smithsonian. It powers our exhibitions, our educational capabilities, and our decision making. Whether we are studying impacts of climate change on local communities, revitalizing and sustaining endangered languages, or pioneering new methods in preservation, or exploring art in new ways, Smithsonian scholarship changes the way we think and work. In some ways, it's the highest form of public service. And right now, our country faces a crisis in confidence in objective truths. Time and time again over the past several years, we have seen the tragic consequences of ignoring data, of ignoring facts. We've witnessed citizens and elected officials disregard evidence. We've seen different sides of an argument refuse to listen to ideas that conflict with their own beliefs and preferences. In today's climate, institutions like the Smithsonian have a responsibility to lead. We need to help restore faith in institutions. We need to champion the importance of high-quality research and scholarship. In a country that is too often unwilling to accept difficult truths, we must affirm our own commitment to diligently and methodically follow the evidence wherever it might lead. That's why, to me, the best scholarship is about combining researching and communicating those discoveries to people from different backgrounds and different perspectives. In some ways, it's about helping our public listen and trust the evidence. The Distinguished Scholar Award celebrates both the strength of the Smithsonian scholarship and the impact our scholars can make by bringing their work to the world. I can say without a doubt that Paula Johnson represents the highest values of Smithsonian scholarship. I am so pleased because I have known Paula since she first came to the National Museum of American History in 1991. Even then, she was exceptional. Paula brings a unique combination of scholarly rigor and a gift for communication. Her research pushes the boundaries of public history, of scholarship, and it really makes us feel that as an institution, we can reach out to many, many people who we traditionally don't touch. To this day, I continue to draw on the lessons that Paula taught me about maritime history. Her early work on the intersection of water and urban space fundamentally changed the way I understood cities. At MAH, Paula is responsible for the Food Technologies and Fisheries collection and is the project director for the American Food History Project. Her research in food and wine history has resulted in substantial additions to the museum's collections and has been featured in exhibitions, publications, and public programmings, including the museum's annual Food History Weekend. She is the project director and co-curator for the exhibition Food, Transforming the American Table, on view since 2012. And she was one of the curators who collected Julia Child's Home Kitchen in 2001. She has curated numerous exhibitions, projects, and published an impressive catalog of books and articles in a variety of fields. Paula takes complex stories and makes them available to public audiences. Truly, she embodies the Smithsonian mission to increase and diffuse knowledge. Her work is a shining example of the good that the Smithsonian brings into the world. I am so proud, so pleased, so honored to recognize Paula Johnson as the 2020 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities. Congratulations, Paula, on this well-deserved honor and an amazing career. Thank you for your contributions to the Smithsonian.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Secretary Bunch, and thank you, Ken, and members of the committee for this honor. Receiving the 2020 award in 2022 is just the kind of quirk that suits me, and I especially want to thank you for giving me something joyful connected to the year 2020. I'd also like to send a thank you to Dr. Hardig, the food history team, and all of my colleagues at the National Museum of American History and around the institution who have sent their good wishes, and of course, my abiding gratitude to the legions of Smithsonian staffers with whom I've had the privilege to work over many years. I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts about food history research and to touch on the tremendous utility and value that the food lens can bring to our work as public historians committed to engaging our many audiences in exploring complex histories. My title for this talk comes from food studies scholar Warren Belasco's influential 1989 book, Appetite for Change: How the Counterculture Took on the Food Industry. With apologies to Warren, although I don't think he'd mind, I wanted to frame my remarks around the expanding interest and acceptance, the appetite for change, if you will, for food history as a viable and fully recognized field of research at the Smithsonian. Our recent efforts at the NMAH and among colleagues around the institution have flourished alongside the work of food studies scholars, a cohort of related academic programs and researchers concerned with food in its broadest interpretation. Warren Belasco was indeed one of the founders of this academic field in the 1980s and advocated for an inclusive and interdisciplinary approach to food and its historical, cultural, environmental, political, and economic contexts. By the 1990s, there were several graduate programs for food studies, now in full flower, and a vibrant community of historians and anthropologists, folklorists, sociologists, and public policy scholars examining everything from agriculture, nutrition, and health to analyses of food systems and industries, to food's power in creating community, belonging, and identity, to food, race, gender, access, and justice. Our appetite for change has room for all of this and so much more. It also involves considering and acting upon food's centrality for future cross-unit, multidisciplinary, and community endeavors, including reaching communities with whom we have yet to engage in a meaningful way. So how have we moved this focus on food forward in terms of research and collecting, the foundation for our work at the Smithsonian? Let me be clear here. Aspects of food history and culture can be found in many research reports and collections across the institution, even from the earliest days with, for example, the George Brown Goode 1887 study of fisheries and fishery industries of the United States, one of the seminal resources for maritime historians, and certainly for me in my previous work at a regional maritime museum. Although the impetus for the report may not have been food-centric, it serves as an amazing window into the technologies and economies and labor aspects of major US fisheries at the time. More recently, foodways research and presentations have been a major component of the Smithsonian's masterful Festival of American Folklife since 1967, and the groundbreaking exhibition Seeds of Change at the Natural History Museum that opened in 1991 and still resonates. And more recently still, there are examples across the institution. In addition to our exhibition, Food Transforming the American Table at the American History Museum, there are curriculum materials on indigenous relationships with food produced by the National Museum of the American Indian, the focus on Black foodways and advocacy at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Anacostia Community Museum's new exhibition, Food for the People. They're all examples of this trend, expressions of this appetite for change. Likewise, looking specifically at the American History Museum's collections, my home, many food-related objects can be found in virtually every collecting unit. But bringing the interdisciplinary food studies perspective to interpreting what we have and guiding our research and collecting as we move forward has provided an opportunity at the American History Museum for deeper more inclusive, and more relevant objects and archives for the benefit of our many audiences. Our efforts at the American History Museum have been sustained for over 25 years, and this talk has given me the opportunity to reflect on the key ingredients, if you will, that went into building a strong foundation through research and collecting that has engaged fellow researchers and diverse audiences. With a field as broad as food studies, there are many research approaches. For us, the tools and methods of ethnography have bolstered our traditional literature searches, visits to archives, and oral histories. My background in folklore and anthropology and my unabashed belief that the stories people tell are valuable windows into history and culture, merged with lessons learned at my earlier stints at the Library of Congress's American Folklife Center and at the Calvert Marine Museum on the Chesapeake Bay. In both cases, I was happily involved in coordinating and conducting large field projects designed to generate cultural documentation of a place, a community, an industry. I'll note that I discovered my deep interest in work and workers' skills, knowledge, and lives during these pre-Smithsonian projects, an interest that has certainly carried through my career here in the Division of Work and Industry. But this field model of spending many weeks, if not more, in a community and seeking out, spending time with, working sometimes in collaboration with, and recording interviews with a broad spectrum of individuals, generated archives of material that now serve as a tremendous resource for the benefit of the community itself, the sponsoring institution, and the public. This model is especially effective over the long term at regional and community museums, as the field site, so to speak, is right at hand. Indeed, there are unique administrative challenges in undertaking such a project at a national museum, but the rewards are significant and long-lasting. In fact, this was the research model adopted by the original team that formally launched the American Food and Wine History Project at the American History Museum back in 1996. That year, we sponsored a public symposium, Red, White, and American, that brought together historians, journalists, and winemakers to share research on the history of wine in the United States, an event that inspired a winemaking family to donate funds specifically for wine history research. A cross-unit team of Raina Green, folklorist, Native American and foodways curator, now retired, John Fleckner, head archivist at the American History Museum, now retired, and Nancy Edwards, former specialist in the agriculture collections and project manager extraordinaire, also now retired. They and I came together to develop a research plan that would investigate the rise of American wine after the 1933 repeal of Prohibition. This is the period when American winemakers, some of whose families had built successful operations beginning in the mid-19th century, had to reimagine and rebuild everything from vineyards to fermentation tanks and cooperage, and even develop new marketing strategies aimed at consumers whose memories of Prohibition-era wines leaned toward excessively sweet, high-alcohol fruit bombs, and not the dry table wines meant to be part of a meal. We started with a case study of one winery in Napa, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, where we were given access to all parts of the operation: the vineyard, irrigation, the machine shop, the office, the crush pad, the winery laboratory, the barrel rooms, the bottling line, tasting room, staff meetings, and everything. We set out to understand the total picture of a modern winery at different seasons. And this one had the distinction of being a historically significant site as well. This is where a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon that was produced in 1973 by an up-and-coming winemaker named Warren Winiarski, an academic who left the university to follow his dream of working on the land in the 1960s, helped spark a revolution in the world of wine. This bottle of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet placed first among reds in the famous Judgment of Paris in 1976. This event, a blind tasting conducted by French food and wine experts, pitted the best of Bordeaux and Burgundy against vintages produced by a new generation of California winemakers. As the scores rolled in, so did shock. The upstart Americans had placed first in both red and white categories, a watershed moment that shifted the orthodoxy that fine wine could only be made by the French and in France. The tasting sparked new ideas about what might be possible among winemakers in the United States and elsewhere. So essentially, we were exploring how American wine went from prohibition and repeal to the Paris tasting and then exploded into an industry that operates on many scales, artisanal and global, that employs millions and is thriving in all 50 states and around the world. The objects and documents we collected, along with the interviews, the photographs, and film footage we created, reveal the range of work, of knowledge, skill, experiences, and importantly, the voices of diverse people behind a bottle of wine. Meanwhile, we also accessed archival sources, both at formal repositories and personally held papers and ephemera, traveling to UC Davis, Fresno State, and individual wineries such as Sonoma's Gundlach Banshu, which was established in 1858 and is still in operation, albeit after a hiatus during Prohibition. Their company and family archives are a tremendous resource that helped us create the timeline before and after Prohibition in order to chart some of the big changes in who was doing the work and what it entailed. Documenting the impact of Prohibition on family-owned wineries and vineyards yielded many personal stories that provide both depth and texture to the typical narratives about speakeasies and rum running that dominate the story of Prohibition in the United States. It also led to recording voices of people whose experiences were not part of the traditional narrative about winemaking and who are not yet represented in the national collections. And this remains a key component, a critical part of the work that we do in food history at the American History Museum, seeking out such stories. One of the many research surprises in the project came from delving deeper into the fact that while most wineries were shuttered during the 13 years of Prohibition, a few stayed in business, producing wine legally for sacramental and medicinal purposes. This required special licensing and revenue stamps, of course, and our research in California's Livermore Valley yielded some wonderful stories and objects, including wine from 1925, made legally by the Concannon family for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. What was more unexpected was learning that while most wineries were shuttered, vineyards were actually expanding. Due to a special provision of the 18th Amendment, male heads of households in the US were allowed to make up to 100 gallons of wine annually for home use during the dry years. This led to a tremendous expansion of vineyards in California, with growers maintaining existing productive vineyards, but also planting new acreage in types of grapes that would travel well across the country by train. In other words, tough red varietals like Zinfandel, not necessarily the noble ones used for fine wine. In northern Sonoma, we spent time with the Pedroncelli family, whose immigrant ancestors from northern Italy were definitely risk takers. In 1927, with Prohibition still going strong, they purchased an old vineyard near Dry Creek, believing it could be the way of achieving some measure of economic independence. They believed the risk of getting into the wine business during Prohibition was worth it, and also knew that they could count on neighbors, other Italian immigrants, if they needed help. The practice of mutual aid was a hallmark of the Italian-American community in wine country, and something we heard about frequently. The polenta pot we collected signifies that sense of tradition and comfort. While the Pedroncelli's risk paid off, the vineyard of Old Vine Zinfandel is still producing, and the fourth generation of the family is now involved. The Pedroncelli story provides a finer point, I think, about the growth and changes in American wine, and a counterpoint to both the large industrial producers such as Gallo in the Central Valley and the very high-end producers in Napa. But perhaps the most significant part of this research revolved around labor, the multitudes of workers, many Mexican Americans, who grafted planted and maintained the vines, dug the irrigation trenches, picked the grapes at harvest, moved the grapes to the crush pad, built the barrel stacks, monitored and topped off barrels, and everything in between. For most of its history, Mexican-American laborers were not acknowledged as the backbone of the wine industry, and our intention was to break that pattern. Among the people we interviewed in 1997 was Mario Bazan, the vineyard manager who had emigrated from Oaxaca in 1973. He spoke about his journey and his life working his way up the ladder to managing one of the most valuable vineyards in California. Years later, he formed a labor management company to supply wine growers with temporary vineyard workers, mostly Latinos, and in 2005 bought acreage and established a winery under his own label in Napa. We have maintained a relationship with Mario and his family, which I'm mentioning here because this is the way this research goes. It's really important to keep in touch with people who have trusted us with their stories and objects and histories. When our colleague Steve Velasquez joined the team around 2000, he jumped right in and has continued this important strand of research into the history of Latinos in wine country, including labor organizing, community activism, the impacts of ongoing discrimination against Latino workers, and the particular challenges of Latino wine growing families in different parts of California. Steve connected our field experiences to his work with other American History Museum curators on the museum's groundbreaking Bracero History Project, as several Latino winemakers had parents and grandparents who participated in the Bracero program, a guest worker program administered by the US government between 1942 and 1964. Steve's ongoing work for food and wine history continues to address these big themes of immigration, identity, equity, work, and community. So wrapping up this particular research track, which I've used to illustrate the foundational principles of the American Food History Project, I'll just add that we expanded the field site pretty quickly. Like tendrils of a grapevine, we set up field trips to various wine regions in California, New York State, Oregon, and Virginia. The archives and objects we've added to the national collections have been consulted by scholars, writers, curators, and filmmakers, and have been used in exhibitions, including this updated story in our exhibition, Food Transforming the American Table, at the American History Museum. As well, over a 6-year span, we curated special winemakers' dinners and accompanying public programs at the museum, featuring the individuals and families whose stories have been recorded by the project. We invited winemakers to attend and to share their histories, not just their tasting notes, as is the norm for most wine events, but this was a request that demonstrated again our allegiance to our research and to making space for people to share their experiences, their stories, and their voices. So the wine history research was about a beverage, yes, but it intersected with many big themes in American history: the migrations of people, the tension between traditional and innovative practices, land access, landscape management and policy, sustainability, the expression of identity in work and everyday life, and the importance of family and community. Beyond wine history, our research and collecting extended to other food and drink related topics and themes, especially after we collected Julia Child's Kitchen in 2001. I'll just say that the story of Julia's Kitchen is worthy of an entire seminar, so I'm not going to get into it, but it's important to note that this tremendously complex object and its association with such a beloved figure in American culinary history continues to fascinate scholars and museum audiences alike. Collecting Julia Child's Kitchen launched us into a new phase of research and collecting around the sweeping changes that rocked American food culture in the post-World War II period, changes that reflect Julia's influence in awakening interest in ingredients, cooking, and the pleasures of the table, as well as the forces that brought us a hyper-connected global food system and the social and political movements that have sought to dismantle it ever since. These are some of the stories that we explore in the exhibition Food, Transforming the American Table that first opened in 2012. While other museum work didn't allow us to undertake another broad ethnographic project, various members of the team took on more focused research and collecting around the counterculture and back to the land movements in the 1960s and 70s. The politics of food as expressed by the rise of soul food and vegetarian restaurants, the Black Panthers breakfast program, the wide establishment of farmers markets, food co-ops, and urban gardens in opposition to the expansion of all those suburban supermarkets. These efforts ultimately involved collecting objects and archives that help broaden representation, another important dimension of our work at the American History Museum. So at this point, in addition to Steve Velasquez, the curatorial team includes Teresa McCullough, who has spearheaded research and collecting on home brewing and craft beer for the American Brewing History Initiative, which is funded by the Brewers Association. She's done this great work for the last 5+ years. And Ashley Rose Young, whose research and programming and hosting acumen are key to our dynamic engagement with the public. A through line that runs through much of our work, individually and collectively, involves the stories and impacts of immigration, especially post-1965, on food and culture in the United States. The museum has explored immigration over many years and in many ways, from the Nation of Nation exhibition, which was on view from 1976 to 1991, to the Many Voices One Nation exhibition that opened in 2017 and is still on view. Migrations comprise a significant area of study for the museum at large, and it has become more relevant as the nation grapples with strenuously held opposing views about immigration policies and impacts. We've found that food, essential to everyone and reflective of culture and place, is an accessible way into discussions with people who may hold preconceived notions about foods of the other, as well as with migrants themselves who are trying to create new lives in new places. This work for the team includes researching how food work was historically and continues to be a toehold for people arriving from different parts of the world, especially people leaving from regions in conflict and upheaval, who often arrive with few resources. We've explored how foods, flavors, ingredients, dishes, and ideas about eating and commensality are introduced and shared, and the ways in which food traditions, deeply held among all of us, are key for reinforcing and constructing identities and cultural traditions and values. The Migrants Table case in the food exhibition introduces visitors to several Americans with roots in Ethiopia, China, Guatemala, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, people who have used their traditional foodways to express who they are and to establish restaurants, food companies, educational outlets, and other enterprises. The experience of migrant women has been a special focus and include a research project begun in 2019, funded, thank you very much, by the Smithsonian Women's History Initiative. It's called Power Through Food. That year, we stayed close to home, Northern Virginia and Baltimore. And in Baltimore, we documented the work of women who had formed the Mira Kitchen Collective, a group of chefs and cooks from Syria, Burkina Faso, Kuwait, El Salvador, and elsewhere, who created a business to provide a living wage for self-determination, independence, and in their words, happiness. They do this through food, preparing dishes from their homelands for catering and community events. We met up with them at the Baltimore Farmers Market and interviewed them in the borrowed kitchen space that they occupied in the Lord Baltimore Hotel, where they were cooking traditional dishes from their homelands to sell. One member of the collective, Chef Iman Al-Sahab, spoke about having to flee her home in Syria and as a widow, leaving her entire family behind when she came to the United States. A former chef at the Four Seasons Hotel in Damascus, she brought significant culinary skills and recipes for Syrian dishes, kibbeh, flatbread, stuffed grape leaves, adding that she had found community and pride with the collective. We've kept in touch, as is our way, and in the past 5 months, we cheered as they opened their first restaurant in Baltimore, where they continue to express their collective and community values through food, conversation, and hospitality. Later that year, the American Women's History Initiative grant took us to Lincoln, Nebraska, a city smack in the American heartland, and has devoted serious resources to assisting people with food, healthcare, housing, employment, and other key services. Again, food work provided a way for migrant men and women in Lincoln to use their culinary know-how to find or create employment and to gain business skills through university-funded incubators, enabling them to establish their own food businesses as bakers, as restaurateurs, caterers, urban gardeners, food truck operators, and educators. One of the families that caught our attention was headed by Thuy Nguyen, who fled Vietnam as a young girl in 1980. She joined relatives in Lincoln, and after completing school and starting a family, she managed to open a specialty grocery store, Little Saigon Oriental Market, followed years later by 2 restaurants that feature dishes from Vietnam. Our time in Lincoln was way too short, but later that year, we were able to bring Thuy and her adult children, who are very active in the businesses, to share their stories at the American History Museum by participating in the Power Through Food program at the 2019 Food History Weekend. Our commitment to linking research to audience engagement has led since 2015 to organizing a multi-day event each year, Food History Weekend, featuring something for everybody, including a gala where the Julia Child Foundation presents an annual award to an individual or group that has made a significant impact on food in the United States, such as DC's chef Jose Andres, Food Tank founder Danielle Nierenberg, and the author, editor, and community health advocate Tony Tipton Martin. The public programming for the weekend, produced in collaboration with our fantastic Office of Audience Engagement colleagues, includes roundtables, conversation circles, and cooking in our demo kitchen, an amazing facility built in 2015 for food programming. This kitchen and public plaza help us connect in even more ways with diverse audiences about food and history. Organized around a different theme or topic every year, Food History Weekend brings together students, writers, practitioners, specialists, and members of the public, and we often end up on the Culture Plaza and the kitchen stage. Although funding and timing for in-depth field research projects has become more challenging over the years, we were able to maintain relationships and conduct smaller scale field visits until 2020 and the arrival of COVID-19. As we all know, just 2 years ago, food, its production, acquisition, and consumption was very much in the public consciousness during the early days of the pandemic. Besides the news stories about sourdough starters and empty grocery store shelves and anxious consumers, it was clear that people working in food were bearing an enormous burden, expected to carry out their jobs while risking their own health and safety to do so. Workers in agricultural fields and meatpacking plants, grocery stores, and restaurants were declared essential and therefore on the front lines, while the numbers of people who became food insecure grew exponentially. The team from our homes developed a different research model, a plan to connect with people in various parts of the country and in different sectors of food, broadly speaking, to hear their concerns and their lived experiences. We wish we could have done so much more, but over several months, we reached out to people in San Francisco, Texas, New Orleans, Mississippi, Detroit, New York, Baltimore, North Carolina, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C. to learn. Eventually, we conducted a few interviews, including one with Maricel Garcia, whose beloved restaurant, Cuchara Mama in Hoboken, New Jersey, was forced to close in July of 2020. Surrounded by objects from her restaurant that also reflected her family's history in Cuba, Spain, Miami, New York, she spoke with us about the devastation of losing the restaurant she had built over some 16 years and how that loss affected her and her staff, as well as how it deprived the community of a familiar place for food from home and commensality. Over several months, I spoke with David Rudolph, a publicist and community leader in Detroit, who sprang into action literally the day Michigan shut down in March 2020. His chef clients were suddenly without restaurants and staff, but they had food waiting to be picked up in warehouses on the other side of the city. Rudolph, who drives a pickup truck, vowed to bring the food to the chefs, who were ready and more than willing to cook for people in need. He described both the fear and the anxiety he felt, driving while Black, driving while masked, driving on roads that had just been closed by order of the governor, all to get to and from a warehouse full of food. Obviously, he succeeded, and with several top chefs in the city, formed an organization, Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen for Good, which brought together chefs, surplus and donated food, and people in shelters in need, all for nutritious meals. By the time we recorded an interview with him in 2021, and that's our intern, Sylvia Marshall, asking the questions, Rudolph, who seems to me to be in perpetual motion, had moved into other arenas to help address the significant and ongoing nutritional needs of his community, including the community garden that he was sitting in during the interview in Detroit. We are still in touch and plan to find a way to bring the Too Many Cooks to our kitchen stage, maybe this year, maybe next. And although we couldn't accomplish the depth of research we wished, we were able to invite several individuals to share their perspectives and experiences on virtual panels and cooking demonstrations for the 2020 Food History Weekend, themed around food futures, striving for justice. The virtual format allowed us to bring panels together from all corners of the country, literally from Hawaii to New York, to explore the historic roots of inequities in food and nutrition access, the impacts of systemic racism on land ownership, especially among African American farmers, and more. The virtual format reached many more people than our in-person events, and consistent with the museum's goals for relevance, inclusion, and accessibility, these conversations are now posted online and available to all long after the actual weekend. The critical issues of our time, brought to light by the pandemic and racial justice movements of 2020, continue to resonate through our work, now mostly through virtual programming, which we have been able to expand through collaborations such as our current Cooking Up History series with the Anacostia Community Museum, the Smithsonian Associates, and with support from the American Women's History Initiative. Thank you again. This program, held just last week, featured Chef Paula Velez, who combined cooking a favorite street food from the Dominican Republic with an impassioned narrative about organizing people for advocacy. In this case, Bakers Against Racism, founded in 2020 as a social community connecting bakers around the world to fight against racism through their baking and creative work. Similarly, our recent Wiki Editathon on Black women in food history was greatly enhanced and amplified by our collaboration with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thanks to curators Joanne Hippolyte and Angela Tate, who spoke about their work of collecting the stories of African American women for the museum. This event tapped into our shared research and resources as volunteer editors created and updated entries on Wikipedia for Black women chefs, winemakers, writers, and educators. With only 19% of wiki biographies about women and even fewer featuring Black women, this was another way of making research count and involving members of the public. In closing, I do want to thank everyone around the SI campus who's answered our calls and emails and jumped on the food truck with us. Food has brought us together and solidified our shared conviction that the inherently interdisciplinary Smithsonian has a role to play in exploring history through the lens of food. We continue to be part of the groundswell of scholarly and public interest in examining how food history can help us navigate our current and future food challenges, like food and climate change. Let's talk. Finally, I hope I've demonstrated that the National Museum of American History's Food History Project's research, collecting, and research-based programming is about what we eat, but so much more. It reflects a deep commitment to inclusion and the experiences of many people, a commitment to relationships and collaborations, a respect for multiple perspectives and areas of expertise, a desire to engage and be engaged by the critical issues of our time, an abiding joy in learning from people about their work and their lives, and a healthy appetite for change. Thank you all. Thanks again to Secretary Bunch and the award committee, and to the Smithsonian community.
Thank you, Paula, for that fascinating account of several important aspects of your multifaceted work. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching. As I mentioned at the outset, we're still in the process of recovering ground lost during the worst days of the pandemic. I'd like, therefore, to remind Smithsonian staff members that the call for nominations for the 2021 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar in the Sciences is still open. Check your recent email. And invite you to consider who among your colleagues you might like to put forth as nominees. The date of the ceremony honoring the winner of the 2021 Smithsonian Distinguished Scholar in the Humanities will be announced in the coming days. In closing, on behalf of the Smithsonian's broad community of scholars, I'd like to thank Secretary Bunch and all the administrative team members throughout the institution whose work makes it possible for research of all kinds to go forward, research which aims to make a better future for humanity through a more nuanced view of mankind's collective history and a more thorough understanding of the world around us.